Years ago, the author C.S. Lewis, he talked about an acquaintance, a friend of his, and he said this guy was the hardest boiled of all the atheists I ever knew, close quote. He said, quote, the cynics of cynics, the toughest of toughs, close quote, when it came to faith. Okay, the guy was obviously adamantly an atheist. Well, one day, C.S. Lewis, was a don at Oxford, and he said they were sitting in the teacher's lounge, probably, having a smoke or whatever, and just chatting away. And then out of the blue, this hardcore atheist says to C.S. Lewis, he says, he says that the historicity of the Gospels, quote, is really surprisingly good, close quote. Now, still as an agnostic, C.S. Lewis was floored because Lewis understood the implications of this. It was almost as if they're sitting there, they're eating, and the guy says, C.S., last night an alien came down in a flying saucer, scooped up my dog, and took off. Please pass the ketchup. He just dropped the subject. But C.S. Lewis, logical, started thinking, how could this guy say this? Because if the Gospels were historically adequate, in other words, what they said that happened really happened, then that meant that miracles occurred. And if miracles occurred, then C.S. Lewis's own basic atheistic, materialistic worldview was simply wrong. See, if you have a worldview which says that miracles, divine things cannot occur, and then there is evidence that they did occur, then what happens to your worldview? Because your worldview says they can't occur. Now, I'm using the story not to get into, basically to represent what from antiquity has been two overarching views of reality. Okay, if you go back and recorded history, there are really two of the broadest views of reality. First, there's what you call, and it's common today in some circles, in some places, the materialistic atheistic worldview. You can find this way back in ancient Greece, right up today to what the men they call the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and so on. In fact, I've got on my iPad right now, I'm reading a book called The Atheist Guide to Reality. This is the most hard, if you ever want to read a fundamentalist, hardcore atheist worldview and what it represents, this Atheist Guide to Reality. It is the most, this guy makes Richard Dawkins and all these others look like compromising, obfuscating, middle-of-the-road wimps in terms of how this guy takes his atheism to the absolute hardcore logical conclusion. Okay, but anyway, you've got this atheistic, materialistic worldview, no God, no creator, we're chance creations of what one ancient Greek said, atoms in the void. That's all we are, atoms in the void. In this book I'm reading now, all we are fermions and bosons, which are the most fundamental subatomic particles. Now, in contrast to that view is, of course, the belief in some supernatural being or beings, from Zoroaster's Ahura Mazda to Voltaire's deism. Voltaire wasn't an atheist. He believed that some God or something created it, to, hardcore fundamentalism that you might find in parts of the U.S. and other parts of the world. Now, either worldview or any version of them, Lewis knew, negated the other. I mean, if one is true, the other is false. Either God or gods or some divine being exists, or he doesn't. There's really no middle ground. And, as the title of my talk, Why Do I Believe in God, suggests, I take the latter view. that there is a God. So I guess the question is, why do I believe in God? Why would I believe in God? Well, why do I believe in anything, really? Why is there anything at all to believe in? Or why is there even a subjective consciousness such as myself to believe in anything? Or I like how one philosopher put it in the 1700s. It's the most fundamental question I think you could ask. He asked the question, why is there something instead of nothing? Okay? If you want to get right down to about how broad and basic of a fundamental question, why is there something instead of nothing? Now, the answer obviously has to be found in some version of either those two worldviews that I talked about, either the atheist version or the theistic version. The universe originated either through natural or supernatural origins. If it's the latter, the universe was made by a being or beings greater to it and prior to it. Okay, if it wasn't that, if there wasn't some being or beings greater than the universe prior to the universe, then the universe had to have occurred somehow naturally. It had to somehow have occurred out of itself. It originated out of itself, which leads really to sort of a philosophical problem. Because if the universe arose out of itself, how did it get there at first in order to arise out of itself? See what I'm saying? How could it have created itself? How could it have... The only way it could have created itself if there was something that would have been there to have created it. But that begs the question, because how could have it created itself to begin with? That's the question we're answering. You know, how does anything create itself without already being there? But if it's already there, it doesn't create itself. So that's a problem. The only apparent out for this conundrum, the only apparent out, that one that has been around for a long, long time, is the idea of an eternal universe. The idea that the universe always existed. This was a belief held by the philosopher Aristotle about 300-400 years before Christ. And it was really held by many people even into the 20th century. This is the idea that the universe always existed from eternity. Now that's interesting, and that brings up it brings up certain logical problems. And I'm only going to touch on one very quickly. And you can Google it and look at it in more detail if you want. It's really interesting enough. It's an old medieval Muslim argument against the idea of an eternal universe. And it was really an argument for the idea that the universe had a creator. And as I said, it's a bit tricky, and I don't want to belabor it, but, you know, as I said, you can research this on your own a little more if it catches your interest. It's one of these things that's kind of fascinating. And I myself am a little, that makes a lot of sense, but anyway, the idea is that an infinitely old universe is impossible. It's impossible because it would have implied that an infinite amount of time must have been passed in order to have reached this or the present moment. But how can an infinite amount of anything, how could you cross an infinite amount of anything to reach to where we are at the moment? It's like, how can you count back from infinity? You know, there's a joke where someone goes, -3, -2, -1, 0. And he says, what were you doing? I just counted all the way back from negative infinity, all the way to the moment. So how do you cross? In other words, if the universe infinitely existed in the past, then an infinite number of moments must have been traversed in order to get to where we are today. But if we can't even count in our heads to infinity, how could in reality an infinite number of moments been passed by in order to reach this present moment? Anyway, think about it. As I said, it's called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's something to think about. But anyway, whatever the validity or the weakness of that argument, the Big Bang Theory has pretty much mooted it anyway. The universe we now believe, once not existing, or many people believe, came into existence. That's the essence of the theory, even though supposedly now there's some scientific evidence calling the Big Bang into question. Because, really anything with science you believe in, there's always going to be some contingencies with it. But anyway, this idea that the universe had a beginning helped somebody once known as the world's, quote, most notorious atheist, Anthony Flew, become a believer in God. See, it's interesting. I remember a number of years ago, I was reading a book, a debate between theists and Christians, or between theists and atheists on the existence of God. And, these arguments, they're as good as far as they go. I'm not convinced in the end that either any of it all totally works completely, though I guess it's kind of ironic. I'm sitting here giving arguments for the existence of God. But I remember I'm reading this one atheist, and I thought, man, this guy is good. I mean, this guy is really, really sharp. He is just honing his arguments in and so on. As I said, I didn't come to belief in God this way. I'm telling my story how I became a believer. What is it, next week? It's funny because when I give all these talks about why I believe in God, I really tell people in certain ways I cheat. And what do I mean by that? Come hear my story next week and you'll understand what I mean by that. But anyway, I'm reading this guy. I thought, this atheist is sharp. And I said, who is this guy? And his name is Anthony Flew. Okay, well, it was much to my amazement that a few years later I pick up a book called There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And this was Anthony Flew. Okay? And what caused Flew to change his mind is Flew started out on the assumption that the universe was, quote, a brute fact. Okay? That's his quote. It was a brute fact. Okay? The universe, it just was. It just existed. He didn't want to get behind it or seek an explanation for the universe. It was just there. Now, if you think about that for a moment, that's not all that rational of an argument. I mean, I don't know, in my humble opinion, the universe seems to be an awfully involved and complicated state of affairs to have no real explanation for it. Okay, it's just to accept the universe. Well, it's just there, period. But Flew said that he's simply taken, quote, the universe and its fundamental features as the ultimate fact, close quote. Okay? Now, I think that tends to be a cop-out, really. As I said, there's just an awful lot out there just to say it just is. Doesn't have an explanation. However, after the formulation of the Big Bang Theory, which teaches the universe does have a beginning, that it had a start, that it didn't always exist, Flew had to abandon his previous position. The universe didn't always exist. It had a beginning. And thus Flew felt he had to abandon one of his most fundamental beliefs. And he came to believe in what he called a, quote, divine mind. Okay? Now, some don't buy into that at all. And they have come up with what they think is their only logical interpretation, their only logical alternative. Now listen to this. This is interesting. They have their only logical alternative is if they don't want to believe that God created the universe. If you don't want to believe that an infinite, eternal God created the universe, then I think there's really only one other logical alternative for you. What do you think that is? If God didn't create the universe, and they're arguing this now, they're arguing now that nothing created the universe. Okay, that's the argument now. I have in my iPad a book, I haven't read it yet, I'll get around to it, called A Universe Out of Nothing. That nothing created the universe. And this is more and more popular. Okay? Let me read you a quote. Let me read you a quote here from a guy named Bill Bryson. It's a book called The Short History of Nearly Everything. Quote, "It seems impossible that you could get something from nothing. But the fact that there was nothing, but now there is a universe, is evident proof that you can." Huh? Okay? But you know, this is, to a certain degree, I'm going to show you, logical. Or it's the only other logical step that they have. Here's another quote. Guy from Oxford named Peter Adkins. He says, "If we are to be honest, we have to accept that science will able to claim complete success only if it achieves what many might think impossible, accounting for the complete emergence of everything from absolutely nothing." Close quote. If you don't want, and I'll show you in a few minutes, an eternal, uncreated God, the only other alternative you have is the universe arose from nothing. We'll come to that in a minute. In his latest book, The Grand Design, the famous physicist Stephen Hawking, arguably they say the greatest living scientist since Einstein. He's got the chair at Cambridge that Isaac Newton held. And listen to this quote. "Because there is a law such as gravity," Hawkins wrote, "the universe can and will create itself out of nothing." Okay, I mean, come on, folks. The universe will create itself out of nothing. So I've got another quote here where a guy says, "We know the universe was created out of nothing, by nothing, for nothing." Now let's look at this Hawking's quote again. "Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing." Now, please, my understanding of the math behind modern physics, I mean, I can do time dilations for special relativity, which if you got high school algebra, you could do that. Beyond that, I can't do it. So I won't even begin to feign to try to challenge Stephen Hawking's physics. But Stephen Hawking's sentence isn't just physics, it's metaphysics. It's abstract philosophizing about what can only be abstractly philosophized about, nothing more. Now let's look at this line for a minute. "Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe will create itself out of nothing." You know, he begins his sentence with, "because there is." Okay, because there is. Now, what does the phrase "there is" imply, other than that there is something? When you say there is, you automatically are assuming the existence of something. Whatever there is, it might be small, it might be invisible, it might be fleeting, it might be beyond our senses, but there is implies that there is something, but it's not nothing. In fact, Hawking tells us what there is. He says, "Because there is a law such as gravity." Okay, now no doubt, again, the physics is heavy, and I have no doubt I'm missing a lot here, but I'm not missing the two nouns in here, law and gravity, in that sentence. A law, in this case, a law of nature, is something, and gravity might be weak. You know, they say there are four fundamental forces of nature, and one of them is gravity, and gravity's the weakest of them all. I mean, I lift my arm, I've got the whole pull of the earth. The whole gravitational pull of the earth is pulling on my arm right here. And all I do is lift my arm up just like that, and I'm able to fight it. But gravity is not nothing. I mean, all those people are not getting plastic surgery for nothing, are they? Okay? So gravity, I mean, isn't gravity what holds the moon in orbit around the earth and holds the earth in orbit around the sun and so on? Isn't gravity responsible for the tides? I mean, it's a lot of pull to get those tides moving. And remember the movie Apollo 13? Remember Apollo 13 when the craft blew up, and the movie, he said, well, we're going to let the the craft go around the moon and then let the gravitational pull of the moon kind of ricochet, or I forgot how it was, ricochet the rocket. So the point is, gravity is not nothing. It's something. I mean, this drops the water bottle. That's reality. So how does one argue that because, quote, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing? Back in the 19th century, a relatively unknown philosopher named Heinrich Jacobi, in a totally different context, he was talking about the meaninglessness of life if there is no God, and he says, but the human being has such a choice, this single one, nothingness or a God. Okay, now he might be onto something here. Now think about this too for a minute. Think about it, and this is where I think this is the point that I'm trying to make here. This is why they're going to nothing. If you don't believe an eternal, existing God who always existed, always was there, then your really only logical alternative, your only other logical alternative is that nothing created the universe. Why is that? Well, from the beginning of recorded history, scientists and philosophers or whatever were trying to find out what is the ultimate nature of the world. What is the fundamental principle? What is the bottom line basis of the world? What is what one philosopher called it? What is the lining of the world? Scientists today, they're looking for what they call a theory of everything. The idea that they can find, it's a metaphysical assumption. Why is the whole idea that you can get one theory to explain the whole universe? Okay, but that's another issue. But they have this idea they want to find one theory that will explain everything that was created, everything. Okay? Now, let's say you can break it down. Some people believe that now that the universe, we often believed in atoms, atoms and so on. These were the smallest particles. Now they believe atoms are made of these superstrings. That's one of the theories now, that these tiny little vibrating strings, and I think like a string is the size of a proton, as like a proton is to the size of our galaxy or something like that. They're trying to break it down to the most fundamental thing possible, okay? But let me say, suppose they do, they break it down. Let's say they come along and they find the fundamental theory of creation. They come down and they break everything down, and they believe they found the ultimate, the lining of the world, the most basic, fundamental thing, rock bottom, that you can't get any smaller, you can't get any more basic. And let's say hypothetically, they come up with the theory, and I've just made this theory up. X plus Y equals Z. They say in the end, if they ever find this theory of everything, it'll be small enough that they could write on a T-shirt. Again, why they think there is one fundamental theory to explain everything, I think that's a presupposition, and I wonder what ultimate justification they have for that. But let's just say they do. They get this ultimate theory, X plus Y equals Z. That's the foundation. You can't get any lower than that. See, the question I have is, if that's true, how did it get that way to begin with? Why the X? What caused the X? Why the Y? Why the Z? Whatever that theory was, why was it that way and not something else? Why wasn't the most fundamental theory Q squared plus T equals P? Again, I'm just making all these things up. I'm just throwing some numbers down. A reason must exist for it being the way it is, as opposed to something else. There's a reason why it's an X. There's a reason why it's the Y, and there's a reason why the X and the Y equals Z, as opposed to something else. Why not B instead of X, or G3 instead of Y? And whatever that reason was, whatever the reason for that, that would be antecedent to it. That would be prior to it. And that would be more fundamental than it. You see the point? But whatever that reason was that made it X, that would have been more foundational and more fundamental to it. And then whatever that reason was, fine. But then why is that? Why? What caused that? Why is that the way that is? And whatever explanation you got for that, you go back and you go on and on in infinite regress. Whatever the reason is, one thing instead of another would be prior to it, would be more fundamental to it. And so the theory X plus Y equals Z isn't foundational. Something more basic would have to explain it, and whatever that would have to be explained by something else, and you go on and on and on in infinite regress. Otherwise, you have to bite the bullet and say that the laws of nature as they now exist is logically necessary. I mean, it just had to be that way. The universe had to exist as it does. No other explanation. You're back to Anthony Fleur's universe as a brute fact. And again, though, imagine you got a train. Train is moving down a track. And imagine that you got an infinite number of cars, okay? Imagine a train of cars pushing each other. The first is pushed by the second, and on and on and on. If the regress were infinite, if it went back forever, there would be no explanation. Where did the oomph come from? Where did the cars get that push to keep it going? You go on and on and on, and infinitely in the back, it doesn't make sense. You say, that's just the way things are. It's just the way things happen to be. Well, again, I would think that sheer logic would say something had to get all these cars moving. I'm not ready to say just what it is. I'm not ready to say that's just the way it is. Well, there's an infinite universe. That's just the way it is. There's no explanation. Okay? If it was logical and necessary for the cars to keep going. It's logical and necessary for the universe to exist just as the way it is, and there's no explanation for it. Well, if you're willing to buy that, fine. In the light of the Big Bang Theory today, some people like Anthony Fleur had a problem with it, even if you didn't believe in the Big Bang. Again, as I said, the universe just seems awfully involved and complicated place to just exist without any prior explanation to it. Okay? It's just, and even more than that, they've done these things called these anthropic coincidences. They're finding these amazing parallels. I mean, these amazing precision. It's almost as if the universe was put together. Imagine you got 30 dials, and these dials are calibrated in numbers that are like 1 to 10 to the 100th. And when they say that all the subatomic particles in the universe is like 1 to 10 to the 80th, if you've got a dial calibrated to 1 to the 10 to the 100th, you're dealing with something quite precise. And that some of these things, that if they were turned even slightly, like 1 to the 10 to the 100th, life couldn't exist in the universe as we know it. Okay, now this just happens to be the way it is logically with no reason, no explanation. It's just a brute fact. Well, if you can accept that, fine. But most people are going to have to think there's an explanation for it. And you really only come down to two, I see, logical alternatives. That's the only one of two solutions. Either an eternally existing God created the universe, or nothing created the universe, as people are arguing. Because think about it for a minute. Everything created needs an explanation. Anything that's created needs an explanation. There are only two things. There are only two things in the universe. There are only two possible things that don't need anything to explain them. They don't need anything prior to it. to explain them. One is an eternally existing God. Okay, if God existed from all eternity, if he was always there, there was nothing prior to him, then God doesn't need an explanation. Richard Dawkins wrote his book, The God Delusion. And his whole argument in the book was, well, who created God? Who created God? Where did God come from? But he's missing the point. That's the whole point. An eternally existing God doesn't need an explanation. And the only other thing, logically, the only other thing that doesn't need an explanation is nothing. Nothing doesn't need an explanation. Why is nothing there? Well, where did nothing come from? You don't need an explanation for nothing. Anything else, if you got your x plus y equals z, y, x, y, z, whatever you come up with, whatever thing you come up with, whatever formula, whatever principle, whatever subatomic particles, whatever you come up with, whatever is, something needs to be prior to it to explain it. Okay? Unless there is nothing. Nothing doesn't need an explanation. So if you don't want an eternally existing God, because so much of science today has ruled out a priori, they have ruled out immediately off the bat, no creator, no God. Okay, they want to do that, that's fine. They think that's how they have to do science, that's fine. No creator God, they can't go that way, that's what they say. Though I still think it's kind of funny. I mean, Isaac Newton was a pretty good scientist, don't you think? And Johannes Kepler and Galileo was all pretty good scientists, and none of them had a problem invoking a God in their science, but for some reason today, they absolutely can't. So if you don't want God, if you don't want a creator, then logically, your only option is nothing. See, it's very interesting. The Bible says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Now listen to this. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Now catch that last part. See, I think there's only two kinds of possible existence. Something that once didn't exist and then came into existence. And then something that always existed. Never came into, never had a beginning. Always existed. And you look around the universe, science now says the universe came into existence. Something had to start it. But what was something that never was explained by anything prior to it? Because there was never anything prior to it. It was always there. And what else could that be but eternal existing God? So really, logically, pure logic alone, and maybe I'm missing something here, and we'll open up. We're going to have questions after this talk. Okay, and then maybe I'm missing something here, but it would seem logically the only two things that don't need an explanation is an eternally existing God or nothing. And if you're going to rule out an eternally existing God right from the start, then you're left with nothing. And that's why, as I said, I got a book in here, A Universe from Nothing. You get online, you'll find all sorts of quotes now. The universe began from nothing. And as silly as that might sound, that's really the most logical alternative they have. So I think right off the bat there, that's pretty strong argument, I think, in favor of the existence of God. I mean, two choices. It's not a new argument, but I think it's fascinating now that modern science in trying to get around an eternal existing God is arguing that nothing created the universe. And so take your pick. Everything that's here, because an eternal existing God did it, or because nothing did it. Anyway, there's another argument too. It's an old one, and it's the argument from design. It's an argument from design. And some people argue that back in the 1700s, this guy named David Hume had written a book arguing against the design argument and so on and so forth. But if you really read the book, he makes a quote here. Let me just read you the one quote, because I thought this was fascinating. Supposedly, this is the book that destroys the argument from design. Okay, this was written in the 1700s. Okay, this was long before people even knew it was a good idea to wash your hands. Before surgeons thought it was a good idea to wash your hands before you went into surgery. So Hume writes this book, and he says here, he's talking about all the organization of nature and so on. And he says, quote, matter may contain the source or spring of order originally within itself, that the several elements from an internal unknown cause may fall into the most exquisite arrangement, close quote. Okay, now, where all this does is push the argument back. Might I humbly ask, quote, where did matter get this information and ability to organize itself into this exquisite arrangement? And again, I said, this guy wrote this in the 1700s. They didn't have microscopes then. They didn't have any concept at all. Darwin, 100-some years later, 70, 80 years later, had no idea of the complexity of life. And we're constantly finding things are more and more and more and more complex than we ever even imagined. And this guy's saying that somehow some internal force, fine. Some internal force, fine, he wanted to argue, did it, fine. But where did that come from? It's like imagining Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Or it's imagining you take paper and ink and just set them next to each other, and something inside the paper and ink themselves, something inherent in the paper, in the ink, you leave them there and they manage to create Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. That's basically the argument that he's doing. And of course, science now has supposedly given us the answer to this whole thing. Everything that, created everything is random mutation and natural selection. Now, I don't want to get into all that right now, but I guess the question, though, is that this science really has become a two-edged sword. And I think the sharpest edge cutting against atheistic evolution. Because think about this. While the science about how, or even if, random mutation could have created the complexity of life, while that isn't debated, while that is heavily debated, what isn't debated is the complexity itself. Now, here's an irony that I don't think should be missed. The more complexity science finds in life, the less likely the means that science claims for its origins becomes. Can you see the point there? They're saying they're finding incredible complexity. It's just going on and on and on, the complexity that they're finding. And yet, they're still trying to argue that it's all by chance. They're trying to argue that it's all by chance alone. In fact, Anthony Flew even quoted some physiologist in his book. He said, "We choose to believe the impossible, that life rose spontaneously by chance." Close quote. But see, now what's happening too, this is another very interesting development. They're looking around at the universe. They're saying life is too complicated to have arisen in our universe alone. Okay? It's just, they do the math. Whatever you do the math, it just doesn't add up. So what have they come up with now? They've come up with this whole new idea that ours isn't the only universe. that they're now arguing that there are an infinite number of universes. Okay? Because if you got one universe, and the odds in our one universe of life arising by chance are inconceivable. In fact, it's so funny, it's very interesting. Francis Crick, of Crick and Watson fame. We all know Crick and Watson, the DNA. I mean, Crick is he's dead, was one hard-nosed atheist. I mean, he was hard-nosed atheist. But Crick really came to the conclusion that life is way, way too complicated to have started by chance. Okay, he said, no way it started by chance. So he came up with called the panspermia theory. And Crick taught that aliens from another planet, from another part of the galaxy, came and seeded life on Earth here. And it was very funny because I read an article in a secular journal. It was talking about this. And he says that, and you could tell how exasperated the author was. Because he says we got one of the most famous Nobel Prize-winning physicists in the 20th century is arguing that aliens came in spaceships to seed life here on Earth. And he just found that a little troublesome. But Crick says, hey, I am a biologist. I know it couldn't have come here by chance. Of course, he's got his aliens coming in flying saucers, which that's fine if you want to believe that. But then that begs the question, okay, well, where did the aliens and the flying saucers come from? So it doesn't really answer the ultimate question. So what they've come up now with is an infinite number of universes. Because it's like, if you're flipping, say you got 10 coins or 5 coins, and you're going to flip them. And I always got to be careful with statistics. My dad was taught statistics, and it's always a little more complicated than the simple analogies that we use, but we'll keep it simple. If this point will work. If I got 5 coins, what are the odds of me flipping them and getting 5 in a row? Okay? But if I've got 10 million coins, what are the odds of me flipping them one time and somewhere in the course getting 5 in a row? I think they're much, much greater than if I just have 5 coins and flip them once. So instead of one, it's impossible that we've got one universe. So we posit an infinite number of universes, and most of those universes have no life in it. But if you have an infinite or hundreds of billions, an infinite number of universes, then suddenly the odds of finding life in our universe by chance isn't so crazy. Okay, fine. Maybe there are an infinite number of universes. I mean, I don't think that it's all theoretical. Okay, I don't think they've got the slightest experimental evidence for this. And I'm kind of a student of the history of science and so on. I imagine if we're around another 100 years, the infinite number of universe theory will kind of vanishes the way a whole lot of other theories done. But even if you find an infinite number of universes, simply makes the question of their existence, what? Infinitely more pressing than does the existence of one universe. Okay, if we're struggling to explain the existence of one universe, where that came from, an infinite number of universes, where do they come from? But look at the extremes here. Look at the extremes that people want to go to, I think, to get away from the most obvious. You got one extreme, nothing. Life arose from nothing. Or now it arose from an infinite number of universes. Wouldn't a supernatural creator be a little more rational of an explanation? Just a little more, seems to me. Now, there's another argument. Then what time am I supposed to stop this? Huh? 10 minutes? Okay, all righty. Okay, well, let me use you another quick argument. I'm Jewish, come from a Jewish background. I was raised on the Holocaust. Okay, that's my religion. That's where secular Jews, you're raised on the Holocaust. That's your religion. Let's say, hypothetically, Let's say the Nazis won the war. Okay? And let's say they convinced every human being that anybody with one Jewish grandparent deserved death. Okay? Because that was the Nazi principle. One Jewish grandparent, you deserve death. Now, there are two basic theories about morality. One theory, common today among secular atheists, is that morality is a human construct. It's like cakewalk jazz or abstract expressionism. Okay? Humans created. Okay? And if you don't believe in God, where else is it going to come from? Okay? You know, there's no God above. The other view is that there is a God, and He's created a moral universe, and He has given us a moral law, and morality stems from God. Okay? I want to use that. Okay. Now, let's go back for a minute. Let's go back. The Nazis win the war, and under Joseph Goebbels' brilliant propaganda, he convinces every human being that anybody with one Jewish grandparent, babies, it doesn't matter. Automatically, you just take them out and you kill them, what the Nazis did. Now, if morality is purely a human construct, if it's purely something that we alone create, like we do democracy, like we do abstract expressionism, if everybody in the world believes that anybody with one Jewish grandparent, or fill it in, anybody with red hair, anybody over 75 years old, whatever, fill it in any way you want. If everybody believes, let's take this one. If everybody believed that anybody with one Jewish grandparent deserved death, how could it be wrong? How could it be wrong? If there is no God and morality is purely human, the way anything else is, and every human says, no, one Jewish grandparent, gas them, no questions asked. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, if there's something doesn't seem right about that, why? How could that be wrong? It would seem, and this is an argument that morality must transcend human. It must transcend just what we view. There must be something above and beyond that. And for many, what else would that be other than God? Where else would this morality come from? And then there's just another, and this is so much an argument, but think about it for a minute. Think about it. It's funny, a while back I read a book called by an atheist philosopher named Brian McGee. It's a beautiful book. You really ought to read it. It's called Confessions of a Philosopher. Very good writer. And McGee was going along. Said he had a great life. He was an art critic, a music critic. He was British. He was a member of Parliament. He had, quote, exhilarating love affairs, he said. He had every success from a human standpoint. Then he was in his mid-30s, and it hit him that he was going to die. And that everybody he knew was going to die. And that anybody who ever knew him, or anybody that ever knew anybody that he ever knew, was going to die. And he wrote these beautiful paragraphs, page after page, of saying it didn't matter what he realized. It didn't matter whether he became the prime minister. It didn't matter whether he wrote great books. Nothing had mattered, because one day he was going to be gone. And anybody who ever knew him was going to be gone. And anybody, on and on and on. And eventually the whole universe was going to be destroyed. You know, the scientists say the universe is either going to collapse in on itself, and the whole thing is going to be the size of a fist, or it's going to keep expanding and all the stars are going to burn out. And the point is, if there is no God, if there is none of that, and just human life, consciousness is all that's here, and one day it's all going to be gone. And he suddenly realized, my life was meaningless. What could it mean? If anything I ever, and he went through this incredible crisis. And he wrote this book. It was on his journey, his attempt. And he starts right off the bat. He goes, I'm very thankful I was never raised in a home with religion. And he just disses it. Belief in anything at all. And he tells of his intellectual journey. And he studied art, and he studied literature, and he studied philosophy, and he studied history, and he studied humanities, and all this stuff. And he ends the book by saying, I'm no closer to any answer now than I was when I began. Because in the end, I think if, you think about it for a minute. My thumb has a purpose. The air has a purpose. The clouds have a purpose. The dirt has a purpose. My cells have a purpose. My lungs have a purpose. Your lungs have a purpose. The sun has a purpose. You go on and on and on and on and on. You look around. Everywhere we see purpose, and you add it all up, and it ultimately comes to purposelessness, meaninglessness. Because eventually one day, they say the universe is just, we're all going to die. And anybody we know is going to die. And if things keep going on the way they, who knows how long life on earth could even keep going. And you add it all up, and if you die, and nobody ever remembers a thing you did, and any influence you ever had will be gone, and any possible influence of anybody, on and on and on, it's all kaput, gone, never. No, he said it made no difference in the end. It made no difference if I had been born or not. And I think he was being very logical. And if you can accept, well, that's just the way it is, that your life is ultimately meaningless, I'm telling you, this Atheist Guide to Reality, this book, he says, because he says, life is totally meaningless, your life has no meaning, and his solution, and I'm not kidding, his solution is take drugs. He says, try Prozac. If Prozac doesn't work, try Paxil. He says, try to find any combination of drugs you can take to help get you through the day, because basically get over it. Your life is meaningless. In fact, I read a review of it in a very secular liberal magazine, and they thought it was satire. At first, he said, I thought this was satire, and I realized, no, in the end, he is serious. Because in the end, he says we're all just pure fermions and bosons, no purpose, no meaning. If you have a hard time with it, well, then just dope yourself up the best you can to get through with it. Now, I don't know, folks. It just doesn't seem to click. It just doesn't seem to be the right explanation for what is here. And again, the only option would be if there is a God who does offer us something beyond what this life is. Because if this life is all that there is, if this is it, and there's no, you could call it pie in the sky, fine, pie in the sky, whatever. But if this is all that there is, if nothing transcends it, it's all utterly meaningless. And yet I just look around and I just see too much stuff that seems to imply too much meaning for it all just to vanish into meaninglessness and nothingness. Anyway, so why do I believe in God? First, I think God is the best explanation for the universe. The only other option they have is nothing. Because an eternal God doesn't need an explanation. Nothing doesn't need an explanation. So, to me, maybe I'm prejudiced, but it seems to me eternal God is a more logical explanation than nothing. Okay, then again, I think just the complexity of life. Then the whole question of morality. Where does morality come from? And then finally, I just think that, and there's others, you've got prophecies in the Bible I haven't had a chance to even get into. And then finally, that if this life is it, there's nothing else, it all is meaningless. And while that's possible, I guess it doesn't, all the purpose and meaning we see doesn't ultimately, it could all be an illusion. It just seems to be a fairly strong illusion. And it seems to be a little more than an illusion. And that would seem to point to something greater than what we have here. Is any of this foolproof? Nah, it's not foolproof. The arguments are good as far as they go. It's not all the way, or they wouldn't have a need for faith. We wouldn't be having this talk. Everybody would be believing in God. Everyone would believe in God. They're not foolproof, but nothing ever is. But all things considered, looking at the alternatives, I think I've argued before and I'll argue again that ration and reason point, I believe, much more strongly in belief in God than in belief that there isn't a God.